hope kind of feels a little empty in a way, like you're just sitting around hoping that something might happen or that things might get better. And I really like thinking about that yearning for the future, wanting something, desire, pleasure, joy, that those are all parts of a better future, that we have to really be able to see it and want it and crave it. And I think that's what I bring to my firework is really giving some people an image of what they could yearn for in this space.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelecanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidal.influence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. In this episode of Conservation Conversations, we continue our mini-series, Conservation on Fire. We talk with Lenya Quinn-Davidson of the UCANR Fire Extension Program. She talks all about prescribed fire, promoting women and diversity in general in fire, traditional cultural fire, and so much more. Now, Lenya is a very important and influential person in the fire community, and we feel very lucky to talk with her. So please enjoy our wonderful conversation with her. Lenya, thank you so much for joining us. Please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, my name is Lenya Quinn-Davidson, and I am the director of the Fire Network for the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, which I know is a lot of words, but in essence, I am the director of the statewide fire extension program. So not like extended ed where you take a class, when you're an adult and you want to take a class on something. It's cooperative extension. So programs like 4-H, Master Gardeners, those are programs most people are familiar with that come out of our extension program. And I lead up the fire program.
So where are you based out of?
I live up in Humboldt County. So I'm in Arcata on the North Coast. And but my program is statewide within the UC, but also national and international with some of the work I do around women in fire.
That's fantastic. Humboldt is such a nice place. Arcata especially, it's so nice, especially coming from Southern California. And it's just like, it's a long drive, but it's just so different and just so refreshing.
It is. I know it's always green and often very foggy, but we've had a long stretch of really nice weather these last couple of weeks. It's when it's sunny here, it is so glorious.
Tell me a little bit more about the fire. Like you said, it was a lot of different words there. So the UCANR Fire Extension Network. So what is it that you guys actually do? You kind of mentioned a little bit there, but just kind of get into what your guys' programs are.
Yeah, so you can kind of think of cooperative extension and the work we do with the Fire Network as being the branch of the University of California that's out in the community, out in the counties, working locally, working with landowners, with agricultural producers, with agencies, and just kind of working with local communities to improve practices, to spread information and research, and to answer complicated questions that folks might have. So we do a combination of original research, education and outreach and training, and then also kind of bringing that to the state level and doing policy work and other kind of more, regional and statewide impacts around different topics. So we have people within Extension who work on growing almonds or livestock production or forestry. And for me, I lead up our fire program, which actually touches down on a lot of that, as you can imagine. I mean, our statewide fire network works on issues related to the built environment, so community resilience, home hardening, defensible space, things like that kind of relate to where and how people live, but then also the larger landscape. So my particular passion and a lot of my career has been focused on prescribed fire, or using fire for beneficial purposes. And we have definitely a whole part of our statewide program that's focused on that, on bringing fire back to communities as a positive tool.
So you said that it's a statewide program and you're based in Humboldt, but how does the work you guys do, how does it differ between, California is a very biodiverse place and a lot of different types of habitats, a lot of different issues throughout the whole state, but how does that differ between somewhere like San Diego on the border wall to Humboldt County where it's, a little bit more open space, a little bit different weather there to the
Yeah.
desert, so.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, California is so biodiverse and socially diverse. And so the way our model is and the way our program's set up is that we have people who work in the different communities around the state and develop programs that are really locally based and focused on local needs and interests and, partnerships. And so, for example, we have a fire advisor, one of our core team based in Southern California, Luca Carmignani, who you know, and he runs a whole program that's really specifically focused on issues in Southern California. Whereas we have folks like me, who based in Humboldt County with the redwoods and coastal issues, and it's a totally different ecosystem and set of landscapes and partners. So it really is kind of a locally catered program, and then the network brings all of those folks together so that we can share ideas, collaborate on certain things if that makes sense, and then certainly on the policy work, that those efforts need to happen at the state level, so it makes sense for us all to be working together. So it's kind of a mixed model of local, state, and then like I mentioned, we have some programs that extend even nationally and internationally.
Yeah, it sounds really complex.
No, that's true. And fire issues are complex too. I mean, they're so multi-scalar, right? You can be working on fire issues at the scale of the vents on your house and changing out vent screens and designing gutters. And, there are these kind of micro level solutions that really are important solutions for how we can live with fire in California. But then you can scale that up to fire management planning at the, tens of thousands of acres scale and planning big projects. And how do you change kind of social acceptability and policy to enable innovative treatments? So it really is multi-scalar and really necessitates people working at all those different levels.
Okay, so you said that one of the big things that you do up north is prescribe fire. So I don't know a whole lot about it. So I have a lot of specific questions about
Yeah, sure.
what it is. And so I guess that's the best first question is what is it? How does it work?
Yeah, well, I mean, in really simple terms, prescribed fire is the use of fire as a tool to meet specific objectives that you've identified ahead of time, right? So using fire under really specific conditions to do certain things on the landscape. And those objectives can vary very, really broadly. I mean, they could be habitat objectives or cultural objectives or fire protection objectives. There are really a lot of different reasons why people would want to use fire as a tool. And of course, people have been using fire in that way for forever. For as long as humans have existed, we've used fire to meet our needs and to kind of curate the landscape in ways that can help us. So that's the essence of prescribed fire. And it gets a lot more complicated as far as how does it happen and how do we actually plan these projects, who's doing it, who's qualified to do it. All of those questions become a lot more nuanced. But at the fundamental level, people using fire.
Can you kind of give us some examples about or of how land managers or agencies or whoever use fire for good, for ecological reasons, cultural reasons, whatever?
Yeah, there are so many different reasons why we use fire in California and across the globe. But here in California, I'd say that there are kind of some major bins of use. One of them would be habitat restoration and invasive species control, things like that. So we can use prescribed fire really effectively to control certain invasive species, things like yellow star thistle, which we have a lot of in California. Also, some kind of nasty invasive grasses like Medusa head and barbed goat grass that can be real problems for cattle ranchers and for others who care about native grasslands. Um, and then also for kind of shrubby and brush encroachment of oak woodlands, of forests, of meadows. So we use fire a lot to manage those kinds of invasive species, and that's a really important usage that can be really cost effective. You talked about, if you're spraying for those things or if you're having to do manual removal of those things, it can be really expensive at a per acre cost. Whereas with prescribed fire, you can sometimes treat hundreds of acres in one day. That would take you weeks or months to do with another type of treatment. But we also, of course, use prescribed fire to reduce the potential for catastrophic fire in the future. So for fuels reduction, and that's the one that tends to get the most attention. Is everyone thinks we're using prescribed fire just to prevent future wildfire, and that's really not true. I would say that the fuels reduction piece is an added benefit anytime you use fire. But that most of the people that I know in California who are using prescribed fire are really doing it for ecological and cultural reasons, more so than just fire prevention reasons. But that is an important component. And then, of course, the cultural aspect. So I talked about the differences between cultural fire and prescribed fire, but they do often overlap. And sometimes we'll see our tribal partners and cultural practitioners using prescribed fire for cultural objectives. So doing it in the way that we typically think of with prescribed fire, with a burn plan and maybe a certified burn boss or something like that, but for cultural and traditional reasons. So for basket weaving materials, for acorn production, for hunting grounds, things like that. So those are some of the major bins that I would point to as far as the use of fire. But I just think it's important for people to know that it's very diverse. The objectives are diverse, the people are diverse, and it's just a really versatile tool for us here in California as fire adapted ecosystems.
I think it's funny because I know that a couple, especially here in Southern California, there's a couple areas where it's like grassland where there's an endangered small mammal, and it needs that kind of disturbance to kind of clear away the brush and shrubs because it needs that kind of low percentage cover. And when you talk to people about that, they go, "Great, yeah, I'm love that. Would love to see the mice or rats or whatever come back." But then when you talk about putting fire near their home, a lot of people are kind of like, oh, I mean, or they see smoke in the air and they're like, oh, wait, so why are we doing this? What are we doing? Do I have to breathe that in?
Hmm.
So I guess my question is, what are some of the challenges that you have had to work through, you and the thousands of other people over the last 50 years working on trying to get prescribed fire and quote good fire back into the habitats of California?
I think one of the big challenges that we've had to contend with is the divide that we've created, the kind of false divide that we've created between people and fire. And, in California, people definitely have been using and having a relationship with fire forever. I mean, native people have always used fire. In more recent centuries, ranchers and other landowners have used fire. And it's kind of more recent phenomenon that we said, fire should be taken out of these systems. We need to suppress all fire. Everyday kind of normal people should not have access to fire because it's not safe and definitely shouldn't be used. And the only people who should have access to fire as a tool are people who know how to put it out. So I would say the predominant culture around fire has been a fire suppression culture and a culture of thinking that people and fire are incompatible. And again, that's just really a false divide that's caused a lot of the problems that we have. We can't take fire out of these systems. Most of California is fire dependent, meaning it needs fire, or fire adapted, meaning that it's evolved to withstand fire. And so I think we've done a lot of reckoning over the last few years trying to figure out how do we break down that divide? How do we reconnect people with fire, gain that comfort, and kind of become human in the way that we always have been, which is that fire is our most important tool. Honestly, it's one of our most important ways of impacting the landscape around us and creating a condition that we want to see, whether it's for food or for, cultural reasons, or for fire resilience in the face of climate change and future wildfire. So I'd say that really has been the biggest challenge, is that people are uncomfortable with fire because they just haven't been exposed to it. And even when the agencies for maybe the last 50 years, agencies like CAL FIRE and the federal fire management agencies have prescribed fire programs, and are trying to do more prescribed fire work, and kind of saying, oh, the public doesn't support it, or people are afraid of it. And I think that what I did in my program in the work that I do on prescribed fire was to say, let's give people access to it. Let's bring them out and get them involved. Let's give them an opportunity to see how it's not scary. Let's make it not scary. Let's do it in the winter when it's really mellow. Let's find ways to do it where people can feel themselves and feel comfortable and not be scared. And that's really the essence of a lot of the prescribed burn association movement that's happening in California right now, which is is really a community movement around good fire and bringing fire back and kind of reclaiming that connection. So not only reclaiming the tool and saying, hey, I want to use it on my landscape, or I want to use it in my community, but reclaiming that heartfelt connection to fire. And I know it all sounds kind of cheesy, but I really would say that's been the transformative thing that's been happening in California over the last 5 to 8 years, is that we have started to break down that divide and gain comfort. Yeah, I mean, we brought the first prescribed burn association to Humboldt County in 2017, and that was the first PBA, we call them. And again, a prescribed burn association is basically a community cooperative for prescribed fire. So getting community members, neighbors, volunteer fire departments together, and putting good fire on the ground in the ways that people want, and the ways that can do good things in the community. um, 2017, first PBA in California. We now have 24 prescribed burn associations around the state of California, and thousands of people involved in this movement. And I think we've changed the narrative. I'd say 10 to 15 years ago, you would definitely hear fire professionals saying, oh, yeah, we'd like to do more prescribed fire, but the public doesn't support it. We're pushing a boulder uphill kind of thing. And now the narrative is people are demanding it at a pace that we can't keep up with. And so training and capacity has become one of our big challenges now. How do we give everyone who wants training, how do we give them those opportunities? How do we host enough burns that we can provide people with that experience and build that comfort? And that's a good problem to have.
Because that was going to be my next question, is like, how have things changed? Or I was going to say since the 70s, 80s, but it sounds like just as recently is when it's actually starting to take hold. And I think you're right. I've worked with some CAL FIRE folks when I first started in 2014 or 15. Everyone, it felt very much like that. And when I go on fires, I'm as a resource advisor, so I kind of help protect resources. And even since I've started, it's changed a lot, where people are now going like, oh yeah, how can I help you protect your nest, or your population of mice, or whatever it is. And before, they're just like, well, sorry, we had to put the fire out.
Yeah.
Do you want to burn down that home, or do you want to save your mice? And it's definitely still get a little bit of that, but it's gotten way better.
It has gotten better. And CAL FIRE has undergone some interesting changes in leadership and kind of in the vision of that agency. I think I really like Joe Tyler, the chief of CAL FIRE now. He is very supportive of things like prescribed fire, and just trying to think about how to shift that culture of that agency. Their focus is putting fires out, so it's an uncomfortable thing to move into. Oh, maybe communities should be using fire, and maybe tribes should be reclaiming their right to burn. And like, that's a discomfort for an agency like CAL FIRE. But I'd say they're working at it. They're working really hard to make that change. And I think we're also seeing a lot of the old guard that may have been less comfortable with that kind of change out, and more young people who are seeing the writing on the wall as far as how we're managing fire in California and maybe more open to different approaches. So yeah, I am hopeful, but I do think it's taken that grassroots movement and that pressure, that public pressure, saying, why aren't we doing more of this? What are you guys doing? What if the agencies have been failing us in some ways on this piece? And how can we do better? And that question has definitely been asked, and it's been asked by the legislature as well. You know that the legislature, I'd say starting also around 2017, 2018 with the Thomas Fire and the Camp Fire and the Carr Fire and the wine country fires, really that those fires pushed the legislature in California to start asking harder questions about what are we doing and what's the proactive piece of what we're doing and how can we invest in that and how can we make the changes that are necessary to support the right kinds of work. And so we've seen some really pretty amazing policy change at the state level over the last few years that supports all of this.
How have your programs and the PBA model, how have that included the cultural fire aspect and the native, you know, fire as culture type of things? Like, or I guess the first question would be, what is the difference between prescribed fire and cultural fire? I know that there's probably like a Venn diagram where things overlap,
Yeah.
but can you start there and we can kind of talk about how the cultural communities are getting involved with your movement there?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, it would be kind of a Venn diagram, and the overall title of the Venn diagram would probably be something like intentional fire, beneficial fire, right? Using fire on purpose for specific reasons. That that there's so much alignment there between prescribed fire and cultural fire. But there are some really important distinctions. And I'd say in the policy work we've done and in the community based work we've done, we've really tried to be cognizant of those differences and respectful of them, because we certainly don't want the prescribed fire work to kind of take over or push out the important work that needs to happen around cultural fire. So if you think of cultural fire being really integral to tradition, to place, to the people who understand a place and have been there forever. Um, Cultural fire really is flowing from and helping define culture in a place. And prescribed fire is a little more prescriptive, right? It typically involves a written burn plan that specifies certain conditions for the burn, has a written prescription for how you're going to get to certain objectives. It's a little more kind of a Western science approach to using fire. And I'd say cultural fire is just way deeper than that. It's about, cultural practitioners who know and understand a place through story, through tradition, through culture, and that fire is an expression of that in some way. And so for cultural fire, for example, when we've done some of the policy work over the last few years, one of the important distinctions is that burn plan component and the written prescription, which is pretty fundamental to prescribed fire, but not something we want to impose on cultural burners. Don't want to make anything where they're required to have a written prescription, because they may just know that it's the right time and place for fire and not need to have some kind of written proof of that. That's like a legal document. So that's just one example. And of course, I should not speak for cultural fire because I am not a cultural practitioner, but I do think just understanding that nuance and that there are distinctions has been pretty central to a lot of the work that I and others have done in California.
So earlier you mentioned one of your programs that's national is the Women in Fire program. I probably got the name wrong, but I will say that on the how many dozens of fires I've been on, it's a bro fest, obviously, but every once in a while you'll see 5, 6, 10 women on an entire fire, and they're always the most badass. Can you talk about that your program and kind of what are the goals of it? Are you just trying to get more women in fire? You're trying to empower the women in fire, or a little bit of everything?
Yeah, so that is one of the programs I lead. It's called the Women in Fire Training Exchange Program, or WTREX for short. And I should say it's not just limited to women. In some ways, it's a little bit of a misnomer because it's really about how do we support and better network and mentor underrepresented people in fire. And as you can imagine, most demographics and most genders are underrepresented in fire. There's pretty much one primary demographic that's well represented, and everyone else is at the minimum. So what we try to do is provide hands-on training. So we host typically 12 to 14-day training opportunities, training events, where we use prescribed fire as a venue to work on wildfire qualifications, prescribed fire qualifications, but also to build in a lot of other types of kind of professional development and connection. So I actually just got back from Nebraska, where we hosted our most recent event, and we were on a buffalo preserve that's owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy in northern Nebraska. Just a beautiful place on the wild and scenic Niobrara River. And we had people from 15 different states and Puerto Rico and Belize all there together, about 45 of us. And we were prescribed burning, but we were also doing really interesting training on kind of mental health and fire. That's a big component of it. On how to, like, things like active bystander, unconscious bias, giving people tools for being better allies and kind of advocating for themselves in this work. And then also just a lot of other kinds of hands-on training. You know, how do you run an engine? How do you use a pump? How do you do stuff like that? We have at those events a range of experience. So one of the basic philosophies of those events is that everyone has something to teach and something to learn, whether they're a high level burn boss who has 20 years in fire, or they're new to fire and just starting out. And so we kind of have everything in between. And yeah, they're just really powerful events that people leave those events just totally empowered and supported and ready to do things better and do things differently. So I always say that, like, we change people's lives, because for a lot of those folks who are used to being the only one on their whole ranger district, or the only queer person maybe in their whole national forest, or the only woman who is on the hotshot crew or whatever. I mean, we have so many people face feelings of isolation and discrimination and just lack of support. And I think that it's really important to give those folks a chance to be together and train. And
we've talked in all of our episodes, we talked a lot about how diversity is always better in the natural world. It's a more stable system. It's a healthier system. And, I don't think it's not a coincidence that the progress that we've made over the last 10, 20 years that we were talking about earlier, it's not a coincidence that this is also happening around the same time that more people from different backgrounds are getting into this field. I will say it's been kind of funny how people just kind of accept me because I'm a white man and I'm like 6'4", and people are like, "Oh yeah, let's go." And I'm like, I don't fucking know what I'm doing. Like, my first fire, my second fire. I'm like, sure, I guess I'll do this. But like, I've worked with people and they're just like, "Oh, well, why don't you do this? And we'll go over here." And they're just like, "Me? Why? What?" So
I think that's an important anecdote. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we do here. We definitely include men in our events, and that's a really critical part of those WTREX events, is to make sure we have men there to participate in conversation, to become good allies. We're all in this together. And so I think it's important for men to also reflect on some of the privilege that comes with just being a man and working in this space. And everyone else does have to fight harder to get to that point, to gain that respect and that credibility. So but yeah, I will say those events, the WTREX events, we really focus on compassionate leadership, on diverse models of leadership, on helping people see that leadership can look a lot of different ways, and that people have a hard time aspiring to be something that they can't see or that they never see in their field. And so mentorship is a really important part of that program, and helping young up and coming people in fire see that, oh, I could look like Lenya with her big earrings and her curly hair or whatever, and that could be a leader just as much as the man who's 6'4" and has that really clean cut look that we're maybe used to in some aspects of fire. So um, yeah, just that exposure and that kind of compassionate, joyful space that we create is really our unique offering in fire. I think W Trucks is a really unique environment for people, um, and again, just really powerful. So I'm super proud of that program. And that program is really the piece of my work that has spread far beyond California. We we tend to host those events once per year in the US. And over the last 2 years have started branching out to partnering with international groups. So people will often come to these events and then say, I want to bring this home to where I live. So we've had, last year we had an event in South Africa, another event in Canada. This year we went to Portugal, and I'm working with some groups in Mexico and Germany and Australia right now. And there's also interest in the Amazon. I mean, it's just really taken off, because it turns out there are passionate women and others working all over the world who really want to see a different culture of fire, and more creative, more diverse, more supportive. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
How did you get involved with fire? Was it something you always wanted to do? Is it something where you grew up, or was it something you discovered later in life?
Yeah, I grew up in rural Trinity County in far northern California, actually just east of where I live now, but it's one of the least populated counties in California, and it's about 80% public lands. So mostly national forest land, some BLM. And my little town, Heathwork, is nested right in the middle of all of this national forest land, and was a town of about 2,000 people when I was growing up. So definitely fire was a big part of my childhood. And we had some pretty monumental fire seasons when I was growing up. 1987 in particular was a really big year for fire across California, a lot of lightning ignitions that caused what at that time were really big, big wildfires. At this time, by comparison, it's hard to imagine those. I mean, they were small by comparison with the fires that we have these days, but fire was just always kind of a big part of my childhood, and smoky summers. And my mom was a caterer on major wildfires, so she would travel to cook for fires. And to be honest, I was really scared of fire. I had recurring nightmares about our house burning down. There was one year when I was a kid where some of my best friends, their house almost burned down, and we had to help them evacuate. So, yeah, just kind of more of a fear based relationship with fire at that age. When I went to college, I kind of knew I wanted to study something related to the environment and ecology. I was just interested in that. My sister is a little older, and she had studied environmental science in college, and I was like, oh yeah, I'll do that too. And and so I took some classes in fire ecology and forestry, and started to piece together that fire was actually a really natural process, and that the area that I had grown up in was actually kind of an epicenter for various interesting things related to forestry and fire. For one, it was the site of quite a bit of research on fire history studies, looking at reconstructing fire regimes through time. There had been a study right outside of my hometown, which really is one of the most remote parts of California. So I was pretty shocked. And then my hometown also had an organization that was kind of on the cutting edge of community forestry. And so when I was a freshman at UC Berkeley, my first year in college, coming from this tiny little town into the big city, some of the guest lecturers for one of the classes I was in was the executive director of this organization from my hometown, who was my friend's mom. And I didn't realize that my town actually was a hotbed of controversy, but also of innovative management around people, fire, and forestry.
That was going to be my next question, was like, how did you connect the conservation, the ecology side with the fire side? And it sounds like it's kind of why it happened for you.
Yeah, I'd say really was, and it took me a while to actually work in fire. I met my husband when I was in college, and we ended up working for his dad's company. His dad owns a stream restoration company, and so I worked in watershed restoration for about 4 years, and focused my undergraduate degree on ecological restoration. And at that time, it was a little more in-stream focused, doing fisheries projects and in-stream structures and bank stabilization and things like that. But I I became really interested in just the concept of ecological restoration and the idea of community-based restoration and kind of small versus large projects, and yeah, the community building and community organizing aspect around ecological restoration. And so when I decided to go back to grad school, I decided to get out of the creeks and focus on fire, and really thinking about fire is a restoration tool, and underused restoration tool, and perhaps one of the most important restoration activities we could be doing in California. And so that was where, like, when I was in grad school, that was where I really decided to focus on prescribed fire and ask the question of why we weren't doing more of this in California. Um, and so that was kind of the beginning of it. And that was 15 years ago.
So someone who works in ecological restoration and creates a women in fire program that now is global and is now expanding all these PBAs and all that. You don't do that unless you have some sort of hope for the future. You don't build something thinking, oh, it's probably not going to work,
Yeah.
So I guess, where does that, and this is what we love about talking to people like you, is like, where does that come from? Why why did you do this? Why, what is it that makes you go, you know what? I think I can change this. Let's build something. And then, obviously you get a job and then they're empower you, like, go do it, please.
Yeah, this is something I've thought about a lot. And I do think on some level, it's my sister and I actually talk about it. My sister is Austin. Her name is Austin. But she's in politics, and she's a lawyer. And it's kind of funny because we come from these like humble background, but we're both incredibly ambitious, I think, but also really hopeful. And we don't tend to respond well to authority or to thinking that just because something's one way, that is the way it should be or the way it has to be. And I really think that comes from our parents. We were raised by kind of back to the lander hippie parents who moved. My dad grew up in Oakland, my mom grew up in LA, and they ended up moving to Trinity County to raise us. And really, like, we're pretty counterculture. They moved up to rural Northern California, and their goal was to spend as much time as they could on the land with their kids, and figured out creative lifestyle choices that enabled that. And we really had a pretty unusual childhood. We would spend months every year in Mexico. We would travel a lot, and we never really had much money, but we were incredibly adventurous. And our parents, kind of the philosophy was like, if things aren't the right way, we can change them, and that you should never feel bound by social norms, political norms. Just go make the change that you want to see. And so I really feel like that inspired both me and my sister to just kind of launch out into the world and be like, oh, that needs fixing. Let's do that. So yeah, I'm really inspired by questioning authority and questioning the things we think we know. And I think you see that reflected in all of the work I do is like, oh, we think fire agencies are the only ones who should use prescribed fire. Why is that? Why do we think that? What's behind that? Is that fair? Is it just? Does it make sense? And no, no to all of that. Let's do it a different way. Let's try something different. Is the different thing risky? Sure, but if we don't take risks, we never get anywhere. Same with the women in firework. It's like, why would we not include all this talent that's out there and these people who want to be involved in developing solutions to these wicked problems? Why would we shut them out? Let's open doors. Let's create, like, let's pave new ways for doing this work, and let's do it in a joyful, kind way that makes people feel good. So yeah, I think that that was a long-winded answer, but I guess I'm a counterculturalist, is like my parents, and really believe that we can change the world if we want to. And it's only in recent years that I've really reflected on this part of who I am, because I realize it does kind of, it's unusual. It's an unusual mindset and way to approach our work, especially in fire. It's like, well, this is the way it's done. And you don't often hear people questioning the way it's done. And I think we need to. Like, the way that we've been doing it has not been working. So we need to think of totally different ways of approaching these issues. And I love the idea of the radical imagination. You know, that you can't make the changes that you can't even envision and in the first place. And so we need to be able to be creative and to really think outside the box, and then we can manifest that and move toward it. And so you asked about hope, and I think that for me, I have a friend who wrote a book called a Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which I think you would actually really enjoy. And I recommend that all the readers check this book out. Her name's Dr. Sarah Ray. She's a professor up here at Cal Poly Humboldt. But it's a book that's all about how do we not become completely overwhelmed and disempowered in the face of things like climate change. And she and I talk a lot about fire as well. It's kind of being in that same category where you can either feel disempowered and defeated, or you can think that there's a way to move forward and that we can, that we can persevere through these complicated issues. And I loved one of the quotes from her book, is to ask, what's even better than hope? It's empowerment, to work toward a way of being for which you yearn. And I love that. It's like hope kind of feels a little empty in a way, like you're just sitting around hoping that something might happen or that things might get better. And I really like thinking about that yearning for the future, wanting something, desire, pleasure, joy, that those are all parts of a better future, that we have to really be able to see it and want it and crave it. And I think that's what I bring to my firework is really giving some people an image of what they could yearn for in this space.
I think it's similar to what we've talked about. Anything's possible. It just has to be of value to you, and I think that has come through very clearly in your programs that you've created and spread around the world. And I see that as like optimism and hope, and you're, like you said, yearning through action and through these programs that are being successful.
Yeah.
And I think that is where, again, that's where we find the hope, is because we talk to people like you. It's like there's, while you're building this program, and it's spreading and it's amazing, and we're all happy for it. There's so many little programs like that all over the world. They're also doing that. And so all of those together is actually, like you said, it's grassroots, but it's like covering the globe. So
yeah, I love that you focus on that possibilism. It's actually, I encountered that term maybe only 6 months ago or something. I think in a book I was reading, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. Because optimism, hope, those are great. But again, they feel kind of shallow. And like the possibilism is like, anything is possible. Actually, one of my favorite quotes is, anything is possible. The impossible just takes a little longer. And I think that's true. And I think about that a lot with the work on the prescribed burn associations, because really, 10 years ago, if you had said, oh, thousands of community members and landowners and cultural practitioners are going to be reclaiming fire and implementing burns in blue jeans and cowboy boots and hiking boots, people would have said you were crazy. That was not part of the vision for fire in California, and we had to show we had to kind of lead by doing here in Humboldt County. When we brought that model back to Humboldt and some of our partners who were doing similar work at the same time, it was it was risky, and it was something that had to be done. And I think if we hadn't shown that we hadn't done that proof of concept, it would not have ever happened in the way that it did, because most people aren't willing to take that first step. And we have to have those bold leaders who are willing to do the things and show people that they can be done.
We love what you guys have done, and like I said, I've seen the progress in the fire world in the last 10 years, and coming in have no idea what's going on, and okay, this is the way it is, and then seeing now it's been changing. It's just so cool. And I think you and your programs are integral to that, not just in California but obviously around the world. So we are so excited to be able to talk to you. And with that, how can people get involved with you and your programs, but also just like some general tips on if they're interested in getting involved in fire? Any tips? I'm sure people, because it is a little bit intimidating. Be like,
Yeah.
do I just walk into a fire station and say, hey, how can I help?
No. Yeah. Well, there are a couple different resources that I would point to. So, as far as the UCANR Fire Network, we do have people scattered throughout the state who are great resources for you if you're thinking about how to harden your home, how to get involved in community-based resiliency, how to weigh in on statewide policy efforts and get involved in prescribed fire. I would just Google UCANR Fire Network and check out our website. We have information there on evacuation planning, on prescribed fire, on your home hardening types of issues, on liability. I mean, all kinds of different topics. We also host webinars and educational events often, so those are posted there. And there's a whole list of contacts, so you can find the person that's in your region. So definitely recommend checking that out. Our website also has a really nice real-time fire map. So you can see, it's one of my favorite, I use it all the time in the summer to see where fires are popping up. And so that's a great resource as well. If you are just curious, you're hearing that there might be a fire in a neighboring county, check out that map. It's updated constantly, and it's really a valuable resource. As far as the Prescribed Burn Association work, we do have a website that's calpba.org. Definitely recommend checking that out and connecting with the Prescribed Burn Association that's in your area. So that website has a whole lot of resources, but it has a list of all the prescribed burn associations in California and their contact information. And that's a way that you can get out on a prescribed burn, go to one of these meetings, kind of learn more, figure out if you're interested in that. Maybe it's something that you want to use on your own property. Maybe it's just something you want to do for fun. I mean, we have a lot of people, I'd say some of our prescribed burn associations, 50% of the people are just interested community members who don't even own property or want to use fire themselves on their own land. They just want to be involved. It's like a fun community thing. And then as far as WTREX goes, you can also Google that, the Women in Fire Training Exchange, or you could reach out to me and I can add you to my mailing list for that. And we do have several events in the works for the coming year or so. And so, yeah, I would just recommend shooting me an email or getting onto our website and checking that out.
Lenya, thank you so much for joining us. I had a feeling this was going to be a really good conversation, and was not disappointed. And we love everything you guys are doing and really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Thank you again to Lenya for talking all about what her organizations do. We really do appreciate the time. Also, please check out the websites for the UCANR Fire Extension Program, the Cal PBA program, and the WCHEX program, which can also be found on social media. All of these links are in the episode description below. Host and producer is Austin Parker. Music was provided by Picture Book Studios. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. Thanks again. We'll talk to you next time.